You think your avoidant ex walked away because you weren't enough, but that's not the truth. They walked away because they were running from themselves. And here's the paradox most people never understand. Avoidants don't return when you chase them. They return when the silence forces them to confront the very emotions they've spent a lifetime avoiding. Today, I'm going to walk you through the psychological timeline, step by step, of what actually happens in their mind and heart before they come back. Avoidants don't leave you because you were too much. They leave because the emotional intensity of the connection activates fears they never learned to face. When you love an avoidant person, deeply, consistently, vulnerably, you awaken parts of them they've spent years burying. And while that might sound poetic, for them it's terrifying. They've built an entire psychological system around staying in control, staying distant, staying self-contained, not because they don't care, but because caring exposes them to pain they don't know how to manage. So when the relationship begins to deepen, when emotional closeness becomes real, when attachment becomes undeniable, their instinct is not to lean in, but to retreat. Most people mistake that retreat as rejection. They think the avoidant walked away because they didn't feel enough, didn't care enough, didn't value the connection enough. But the truth is far more complicated. They didn't leave you. They left the intensity inside themselves that the relationship brought to the surface. Avoidants often come from environments where emotional expression was unsafe, unpredictable, or dismissed. They survived by shutting down their needs and convincing themselves that dependency was dangerous. Love, intimacy, connection, all the things most people crave, are the exact things that make an avoidant feel trapped, overwhelmed, or exposed. So when someone comes into their life and provides genuine warmth and emotional availability, it doesn't relax them. It destabilizes their internal narrative. They start to feel the pressure of expectations, the weight of vulnerability, the possibility of disappointment. And because they don't have the emotional tools to express these fears, they do what they've always done: they withdraw. At first it's small, slightly less communication, a bit more distance, subtle emotional shutdown. But eventually the pressure becomes too much, and they convince themselves that leaving is the only way to regain balance. This is where the misunderstanding happens. When an avoidant walks away, they often appear cold, detached, or indifferent. But that emotional flatness is not apathy, it's protection. They numb themselves because feeling is overwhelming. They disconnect because staying connected feels like drowning. This is why avoidants can leave suddenly, even after a period of closeness. The more attached they become, the more fear intensifies, and the more urgently they feel the need to escape. It's not logical, it's survival-based. Their nervous system reacts as if emotional intimacy is a threat, not a gift. And yet, the moment they pull away, an entirely different emotional process begins within them. The initial relief they feel is not about escaping you, it's about escaping the internal pressure intimacy created. But that relief fades because avoidants don't actually want to be alone. They want connection, but they want it in a way that doesn't overwhelm their emotional system. The problem is, true connection requires vulnerability, something they've spent their whole life trying to avoid. So instead, they tell themselves a story that leaving was the right choice, that independence is better, that they're safer without emotional closeness. But those stories eventually crumble because they're built on avoidance, not truth. Over time, memories surface, not in immediate emotional waves, but in delayed echoes. They begin to feel the absence, the missing pieces, the loss of a presence that once made them feel seen in a way they rarely experience. But they won't admit this to themselves right away. Admitting it means acknowledging vulnerability. Admitting it means confronting the very emotions that drove them away in the first place. But slowly, gently, inevitably, the truth breaks through. Avoidants don't leave someone who mattered without emotional consequences. They feel the loss, they feel the weight. They just feel it later than everyone else. The hardest part for the person who was left is believing they weren't the problem, because avoidants often exit in ways that make the other person question their worth. But the emotional intensity you brought into the relationship was not too much. It was simply unfamiliar to them. You didn't scare them away with neediness. You activated a part of them they've spent their entire life trying to silence. And when faced with that emotional awakening, they chose the only coping mechanism they know: distance. Understanding this doesn't excuse their behavior, but it does explain it, and it shifts the narrative from self-blame to clarity. Their departure was not a failure on your part. It was a confrontation with their own emotional limitations. Avoidants don't leave you because they don't care. They leave because caring demands emotional engagement they're terrified to give. And the paradox is this: the very intensity they run from is the exact thing that eventually pulls them back once they've had time to face the feelings they initially rejected. Silence is the environment in which an avoidant person begins to confront themselves. It is the space that forces them to feel what they have been avoiding for years. Avoidants are masters of distraction and emotional deflection. They fill their lives with activity, work, hobbies, and social interaction to keep from looking inward. They avoid emotional intensity because it feels threatening to their sense of control and autonomy. When you stop chasing them, when you stop giving them the emotional attention they can hide from but secretly crave, you create a vacuum. That vacuum is the first signal to their psyche that they can no longer ignore what they truly feel. Silence is not emptiness. It is a mirror reflecting the truths they have carefully avoided. In that reflection, they begin to encounter the very emotions they have worked so hard to suppress: longing, regret, confusion, and, ultimately, a deep awareness of loss. The absence of pursuit from you removes the distractions they rely on and forces them into confrontation with their own internal reality. It is in this quiet that the psychological work of returning begins. Avoidants experience silence differently than most people. Where others might feel lonely or bored, an avoidant feels a subtle but persistent pressure, an internal tension that cannot be relieved by external activity. At first, they may try to fill the void, continuing their routines, immersing themselves in projects or relationships that are less threatening. They convince themselves that they are fine, that the relationship they left is irrelevant, that their independence is preferable. But these are temporary shields. The human mind cannot ignore emotional truth indefinitely, and avoidants are not exceptions. The absence of your presence creates a context in which suppressed emotions start to bubble to the surface. Little things, a song, a place, a memory, trigger subtle awareness. They don't yet fully understand these feelings because they have been conditioned to mistrust their own emotional responses. But the first cracks begin to appear. This stage is crucial because it is not about longing in the conventional sense. Avoidants do not immediately yearn for what they lost in an overtly emotional way. Instead, they experience a slow, creeping realization that their life feels different, incomplete, or somehow less satisfying. Silence allows them to feel without the immediacy of confrontation. It is a quiet awakening. The moments of reflection accumulate, often unnoticed at first. They may experience fleeting thoughts of, "I wonder how they are," or a vague sense that something important is missing. Unlike most people who can directly experience regret and sorrow, avoidants experience these emotions in fragments and delayed patterns. They feel shadows of what has passed rather than the full weight at once, but the accumulation is inevitable. Avoidance nervous systems are wired to perceive emotional intensity as threatening. When someone is no longer present to provide a buffer or distraction, that intensity returns internally. Silence is the mechanism that triggers this internal confrontation. Their mind begins to replay conversations, moments, and shared experiences, analyzing them with a detached but persistent focus. They start noticing the ways in which the person they left brought stability, understanding, or validation. They observe their own responses, the avoidance patterns they relied on, and the emotional costs of leaving. This reflection is subtle at first. It often masquerades as curiosity or casual wondering, but as the days, weeks, and months go by, these reflections deepen. Avoidants cannot maintain their previous level of detachment in the face of ongoing absence. The emotional tension built in silence often leads to internal conflict. Avoidants may feel relief that they left, but they also feel the pull of what was real, meaningful, and nourishing in the relationship. This conflict can be confusing for them. It is not immediate or explosive, but it is persistent. The absence forces them to confront their own role in the loss, their tendencies to withdraw, and the consequences of their protective behaviors. They start to recognize patterns, how their fear of intimacy created distance, how avoidance prevented vulnerability, and how leaving someone they cared for did not erase attachment but merely suppressed it temporarily. Silence, paradoxically, becomes a teacher. It forces them to engage with emotions they had long denied, and it compels them to reckon with the gaps between desire and behavior. It is in this space of quiet reflection that avoidants may begin to consider reconnection. They don't rush this process because rushing requires emotional engagement they still find threatening. Instead, they move cautiously, internally evaluating whether they can manage intimacy differently if they attempt to return. Silence gives them the opportunity to practice self-reflection, to assess their fear, and to measure the value of what they lost. They begin to recognize that the absence of pursuit is not abandonment, it is a mirror of their own avoidance. They see in the lack of chasing the strength, boundaries, and stability of the person they left. They recognize the consequences of their own fear-driven choices. Ultimately, silence is the catalyst for transformation in the avoidant mind. It removes distractions, removes justification, and removes the possibility of running from oneself indefinitely. It creates the conditions necessary for awareness, regret, and eventual desire to reconnect. When an avoidant starts to feel the weight of absence, it is not because of loneliness in a superficial sense. It is because the silence exposes the truths they cannot escape. They miss the connection, they regret the distance they created, and they slowly confront the vulnerability they tried to avoid. Silence is the environment in which they are forced to reckon with themselves, and it is through this reckoning that the seeds of return are planted. In the end, what most people interpret as indifference is actually the avoidant's internal struggle finally coming to light. The absence you create is not emptiness, it is a mirror reflecting their suppressed emotions, their regrets, and their longing. It is the stage where avoidance begins to dissolve, where reflection replaces distraction, and where ultimately the journey toward emotional engagement and potential return begins. Silence in the avoidant timeline is not passive, it is the hidden force that transforms fear into awareness and absence into the possibility of reconnection. Avoidants follow a predictable emotional timeline before they return, even if it appears chaotic or arbitrary from the outside. Their behavior is guided not by malice or indifference, but by deep-seated patterns rooted in fear, conditioning, and survival mechanisms. Understanding this timeline is critical for anyone who has been left by an avoidant partner, because it explains the seemingly contradictory behaviors. Withdrawal followed by interest, silence followed by small gestures, and distance followed by the desire to reconnect. The timeline is not linear in the way most people experience events, but it is sequential in the psychological sense, moving from relief to routine, from memory echoes to regret, and ultimately toward contemplation of return. Recognizing these stages allows you to interpret their actions not as rejection but as a process, one governed by internal emotional logic that they themselves may not fully understand at first. The first stage is relief. When an avoidant leaves, they often experience a sense of liberation, not from you, but from the intensity of closeness that made them uncomfortable. This relief is a defense mechanism, a temporary reprieve that allows them to avoid feeling the emotions they have suppressed for years. It may seem abrupt or cold to an outsider, but internally, this is a necessary step. The avoidant brain equates emotional intensity with risk, and withdrawal is the safest immediate response. Relief is short-lived, however, because while they have removed themselves from proximity, the emotional bond remains internally. The separation gives them the illusion of freedom, but it cannot erase attachment entirely. After relief comes the stage of routine. Avoidants are creatures of structure and self-regulation. They retreat into familiar patterns, distractions, and projects, telling themselves that independence is preferable and that the relationship they left is no longer relevant. Routine provides them with stability and reassurance that they are in control. They fill their lives with activity to prevent reflection, to delay emotional confrontation. This stage is essential because it allows the avoidant to adjust to the absence without being overwhelmed immediately by feelings of loss. Yet, as days and weeks progress, the very structure they cling to begins to reveal its insufficiency. The routines cannot replace the emotional connection they experienced, even if they cannot admit it consciously. The third stage involves memory echoes. Avoidants begin to notice fragments of the past, a place you once visited together, a song you both liked, a phrase or gesture that resurfaces unexpectedly. These are subtle triggers that provoke reflection. Avoidants do not experience emotional waves in the same way most people do. They process them indirectly in fragments and delayed impressions. The echoes remind them of what they had, what they lost, and what they may have taken for granted. It is often confusing and unsettling for them because they are forced to feel emotions they have long suppressed while still trying to maintain the distance they crave. This stage marks the first conscious recognition that the absence is significant and that the emotional impact of the relationship is profound. Following memory echoes comes the stage of realization. At this point, avoidants begin to understand the consequences of their departure. They recognize that leaving was not a neutral act, but one that has real emotional costs. They start replaying conversations and interactions in their minds, analyzing their behavior and its impact on the other person. They recognize the loyalty, consistency, and emotional investment that was present in the relationship, often for the first time. This realization can be uncomfortable, even painful, because it requires acknowledging their avoidance patterns and the fear that drove them away. Avoidants are rarely able to confront these truths immediately. Instead, realization emerges gradually, often in private moments of reflection when they are alone and unable to distract themselves. Regret follows realization, and it is a powerful stage. Avoidants feel the loss of someone who understood them in ways few others could. They recognize the value of the relationship and the irreplaceable qualities of the person they left. Unlike most people, avoidants experience regret indirectly and slowly. It may manifest as repeated reflection, restless thoughts, or subtle attempts to reconnect emotionally. They often feel conflicted, torn between the comfort of distance and the desire to regain what they lost. The intensity of regret grows as they confront the truth that their avoidance, which once felt protective, has led to meaningful loss. It is a humbling stage, forcing them to reconcile fear of vulnerability with the undeniable truth of attachment. Finally, the avoidant moves into contemplation of return. This is not a sudden or impulsive stage. It is deliberate and cautious. By now, they have processed their emotions to the extent that they can consider engagement without being overwhelmed. They test the waters slowly, often through minor gestures, indirect communication, or careful observation. They are attempting to gauge whether the emotional environment has changed enough for them to re-enter safely. The contemplation of return is guided by the cumulative work of the previous stages: relief, routine, memory echoes, realization, and regret. Without these stages unfolding in sequence, the avoidant cannot reach a point where they feel capable of re-engaging meaningfully. Understanding this emotional timeline helps clarify why avoidants behave the way they do. Their actions are not random, manipulative, or purely self-serving. They are part of a complex, internally governed process. Each stage serves a psychological purpose, moving the avoidant from avoidance and denial toward reflection, insight, and eventually potential reconnection. For those on the receiving end of avoidant behavior, recognizing these patterns provides clarity, reduces confusion, and allows for informed decisions about boundaries, self-respect, and engagement. By seeing the timeline, you understand that avoidance is not the absence of emotion, but a delayed protective response to emotional intensity. It explains the paradox of their behavior: retreat followed by interest, silence followed by subtle re-engagement, and distance followed by cautious return. In essence, the avoidant emotional timeline is a predictable journey through internal fear, reflection, and eventual acknowledgement of what was truly lost. Regret hits an avoidant late, but when it does, it hits with a force that is both unavoidable and transformative. Avoidants are wired to suppress emotions, to deflect intimacy, and to maintain distance as a form of self-preservation. From the outside, it may seem as if they are indifferent or unaffected by loss, but the truth is far more complex. The emotions they feel are delayed, muted, and often filtered through layers of defense mechanisms. They experience life internally in patterns of detachment and compartmentalization, and this affects how they process relationships. When an avoidant leaves someone they care about, the immediate effect may be relief or a sense of freedom. That relief masks the undercurrent of attachment that never truly disappears. Over time, however, the absence of the person they left begins to generate a quiet but persistent internal tension. This tension is the seed of regret. Regret for an avoidant is not immediate because their psychological system protects them from vulnerability. If they were to feel the full impact of loss at the moment of departure, it could overwhelm their nervous system, triggering panic, anxiety, or emotional shutdown. Instead, regret emerges gradually, often after they have attempted to fill the void with routines, distractions, or new experiences. The realization begins in fragments, moments when they notice a memory unexpectedly, when they see something that reminds them of the person they left, or when they experience a sense of emptiness that cannot be filled by anything external. These small triggers accumulate, slowly eroding the defenses they relied upon. The longer they are separated, the more these fragments intensify, converging into a powerful awareness of what they lost. Unlike most people, avoidants process regret in a delayed, fragmented way. They rarely experience dramatic emotional outbursts. Instead, they feel subtle internal pressure. This pressure grows over time and forces reflection. They begin replaying events and conversations in their minds, analyzing where they may have acted out of fear, how they withdrew too quickly, or how their avoidance patterns harmed their relationship. In many cases, they start comparing the person they left with others, recognizing that the qualities they dismissed, emotional consistency, loyalty, attentiveness, are rare and valuable. They also start to see the missed opportunities for connection and the consequences of leaving. This internal reckoning is uncomfortable because it requires them to confront the very fears they ran from: vulnerability, dependency, and emotional exposure. Regret in an avoidant is often accompanied by conflicting emotions. They may feel relief for having maintained independence and avoided immediate discomfort, but they simultaneously feel longing, sorrow, and sometimes shame. This internal conflict is difficult to articulate because avoidants are not accustomed to identifying or expressing their emotions. They may rationalize the loss, blame circumstances, or convince themselves that the absence is inconsequential. Yet deep down, the emotional truth persists, surfacing in subtle ways: a lingering thought, a sudden pang of sadness, or even an inexplicable desire to reconnect. The complexity of these emotions is what makes avoidant regret both profound and transformative. It is a confrontation with themselves, their limitations, and the costs of their defensive behaviors. As this regret grows, avoidants begin to consider their role in the relationship more critically. They may acknowledge that their withdrawal was unnecessary, that they left to avoid discomfort rather than because the relationship was flawed. They start to recognize the unique qualities of the person they lost, someone who provided understanding, consistency, and emotional investment. This awareness is humbling, forcing them to reconcile their fear-driven behavior with the reality of loss. Unlike immediate emotional reactions, which can be impulsive and erratic, avoidant regret builds slowly, allowing them to process their feelings internally before taking any action. This slow-building regret is what differentiates avoidance from other attachment styles. It is deeply introspective, delayed, and ultimately tied to self-awareness. Regret eventually creates the conditions for contemplation of return. It is only when the avoidant has processed enough of their emotions that they can consider reconnecting, without being overwhelmed by fear or anxiety. This is why avoidants rarely return immediately after leaving. They need time to reflect, to understand the consequences of their actions, and to reconcile their desire for connection with their fear of vulnerability. The return, when it happens, is deliberate and cautious, rooted in the recognition of loss rather than impulsive desire. Avoidants who experience profound regret are often more self-aware and capable of approaching reconnection in a more balanced, emotionally engaged way than they were during the initial relationship. Understanding the delayed nature of avoidant regret is critical for anyone dealing with this type of partner. It explains why avoidants may appear indifferent or unaffected in the immediate aftermath of separation, only to later experience intense emotional awareness. Their timeline is different from most people's. What seems like apathy is actually a protective mechanism, and what appears as delayed interest is often the manifestation of deep, slowly processed regret. Recognizing this allows you to interpret avoidant behavior more accurately without internalizing blame or misunderstanding their motives. It also provides insight into the emotional patterns that may guide their eventual return, as regret is the emotional force that transforms avoidance into reflection and reflection into the possibility of reconnection. Ultimately, regret hits an avoidant late because their nervous system cannot tolerate the full weight of emotional intensity immediately, but when it does hit, it forces them to confront truths they have long avoided: the consequences of their withdrawal, the value of the person they lost, and the limitations of their protective mechanisms. This delayed regret is not a flaw. It is a sign that they are processing emotions at a level they previously could not. It is the turning point in the avoidant timeline, the stage where awareness replaces avoidance and the possibility of return emerges. The emotional weight of regret, though delayed, is both undeniable and transformative, shaping the way avoidants engage with themselves, their past actions, and the relationships they may seek to restore. They return when they understand that your absence is more painful than their fear of intimacy. Avoidants are driven by an internal tension between the desire for connection and the fear of vulnerability. Throughout their emotional timeline, relief, routine, memory echoes, realization, and regret, they gradually confront the truths they initially ran from. It is only after this slow process that they reach a point where returning feels possible, where the emotional cost of staying distant outweighs the perceived safety of avoidance. Avoidants do not come back impulsively or out of superficial longing. Their return is measured, cautious, and rooted in the awareness that they lost something meaningful. Understanding this principle is essential because it reframes their behavior not as indecisiveness or manipulation, but as the culmination of a deeply psychological process that resolves internal conflict and prepares them for emotional engagement. The journey toward return begins long before they make contact. Avoidants spend time reflecting on the absence, analyzing their behavior, and processing the emotional consequences of leaving. They observe the world without you in it, noting how the stability, care, and presence you provided were unique and irreplaceable. This is not a rapid realization, it is gradual, almost imperceptible. Each memory echo, each moment of reflection, intensifies the internal conflict, the tension between wanting to reconnect and fearing vulnerability. Eventually, this tension reaches a threshold where avoidance is no longer sustainable. They recognize that the emotional discomfort of facing intimacy is less threatening than the emptiness your absence has created. This marks the turning point. They understand, consciously or subconsciously, that the emotional cost of not having you in their life exceeds the perceived risk of opening themselves up again. Returning requires courage for an avoidant because vulnerability is inherently risky to them. They fear rejection, criticism, and loss of control. Yet at this stage, they have processed enough of their internal experience to accept these risks. The absence has revealed the value of emotional connection, and the regret stage has clarified what they lost. They begin testing the waters cautiously. Small gestures, tentative communication, or subtle attempts to gauge your response. Each interaction is carefully measured. They are attempting to assess whether the relational environment has changed enough to allow for engagement without triggering overwhelming anxiety. Their return is not reckless or impulsive. It is a calculated attempt to reconcile desire for connection with fear of intimacy, guided by the lessons of the previous emotional stages. Avoidants often struggle with self-doubt during this process. They question whether the other person will accept them, whether they can engage differently than before, and whether the risk of vulnerability is worth the potential reward. These doubts reflect the deep self-protective mechanisms they have relied upon for years. The very patterns that once caused distance now challenge their capacity to return authentically. Yet when they decide to reach out, it is because they have weighed these fears against the undeniable truth. Your absence is a constant reminder of what they forfeited. The longing they feel is not superficial. It is rooted in recognition of your unique presence, your consistency, and your ability to provide emotional engagement in ways that resonate with them on a deep level. The timing of their return is significant. Avoidants do not return immediately after leaving because the emotional stages they undergo cannot be rushed. Relief, routine, memory echoes, realization, and regret must unfold before they are capable of reconciling fear and desire. Only when they reach the point where the pain of absence outweighs avoidance do they attempt re-engagement. This explains why avoidants may seem inconsistent, sporadic, or delayed in their actions. Their behavior is governed not by indecision or manipulation, but by the internal progression of emotional processing that ultimately leads to readiness. The return is a signal that they have done the psychological work required to face intimacy without being overwhelmed. When an avoidant comes back, it is often accompanied by humility and reflection. They may express awareness of past mistakes, acknowledge their previous withdrawal, or communicate a desire to approach the relationship differently. This is the result of having processed their emotions internally. They have recognized the impact of avoidance on both themselves and the person they left. Their return is not merely about rekindling connection, it is about integrating their past behaviors with the insight they have gained. They seek to re-engage in a way that balances emotional closeness with the boundaries they need to maintain, demonstrating growth and increased self-awareness. It is important to note that their return is not guaranteed. The avoidance decision to re-engage depends on the interplay of internal reflection and external cues. Your boundaries, consistency, and emotional stability during their absence signal to them whether reconnection is viable. Avoidants are sensitive to relational dynamics, and they are more likely to return when they perceive that engagement will not trigger overwhelming anxiety or conflict. This underscores the importance of maintaining self-respect and stability while allowing space for them to process their emotions. Your absence serves as both a mirror and a test, revealing the value of what they left and the possibility of a healthier connection if they choose to return. Ultimately, the avoidant returns when they understand that your absence is more painful than their fear of intimacy. This moment reflects the culmination of a complex emotional journey, one in which avoidance gradually gives way to awareness, regret, and readiness for engagement. Their return is measured, cautious, and deliberate, informed by reflection, recognition of loss, and the desire to approach the relationship differently. For those who have been left by an avoidant, understanding this dynamic reframes their behavior. What appears as inconsistency or delay is actually the product of internal processing, and what emerges is a return that is not impulsive but psychologically and emotionally grounded. The absence you maintained, the stability you displayed, and the space you allowed are the factors that ultimately make their return possible, highlighting the paradox of avoidance. They come back only after facing the very fears that initially drove them away.